So let's kick this day with session 6, collaborative approach to strengthening system reliability. This session is sponsored by ESMIA, and I'd like to, again, thank you, Kathleen Bayanco and her team for their support and active contribution in all our activities. I would like now to invite Scott Barfield-McGuinness and his panelists to the stage. Scott is a professional engineer with over 38 years of experience in the utility sector. Having worked with several US utilities, he joined NERC in 2011. At NERC, Scott serves as principal technical advisor in the Power Risk Issues and Strategic Management Group, supporting NERC and its regional entities, collectively known as the Hero Enterprise. Let's give a warm welcome to Scott and to our speaker so they launch this conversation.
Thank you, Edward. My pleasure to return this year again from last year to collaborate and enjoy this community of modeling and planning and to make resilience and reliability much more valuable. Today's panel will be 4 presenters collaborating approach to strengthening system reliability to bring attention to several areas such as extreme weather, scenarios, margins, and hourly planning. The first we'll hear from me is in terms of what NERC has been doing, but also hear about how IESO uses modeling to achieve acquisition targets, then perspectives on maintaining reliability in a 100% decarbonized power sector with interrelated roles of flexible resources. Third, work-related practices for representing climate impacts in bulk electric system models under EPRI's Climate Ready program. And last but not least, energy system modeling for the real world and transforming modeling approaches for sustaining resilient and urban development. We have quite a session today, and I hope everyone enjoys that. Start off with, changed to one, but not the other. Yeah. We're there? Okay, great. So NERC's mission is to ensure the reliability and security of the bulk power system. We do that through registering owners, users, and operators across North America, including Canada, US, and Baja Norte. And the reason we do that is because the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the United States authorized NERC to become the Electric Reliability Organization. As a part of our duties, ensuring reliability and security, we have 4 key objectives. Those include to educate, train, and certify industry personnel in what most people know, right reliability standards. And then we have 6 regions who are charged with doing the compliance and enforcement. And lastly, we have a series of assessments that we do every year, winter, summer, long-term reliability assessment, as well as case quality metrics for what? Modeling. We make sure the fidelity of modeling is very good. First thing I'd like to cover with you that Edward asked me to talk about is the Interregional Transfer Capability Study. The United States Congress mandated NERC to do this study, having a concern about the ability to move power and energy across the grid. There are 3 key objectives that we had to do. First was to make sure that we knew the current state of the system, and then determine what we're actually calling the, oops, did I go too far? Make sure. Wow, sorry about that. I got out of sequence, apologize. Let me just go ahead and go here and then we'll come back to the other. That make sure you knew what prudent additions would be. And that's not just transmission. We're talking about transfer capability of the transmission system, but that's could be any source, demand response, resources, whatever the entity needs to do to mitigate that transfer capability need. And then thirdly, to make sure we maintain and continue to monitor that capability going forward. One of the key lessons from that is to make sure that you do planning in a wide area approach. You can't use basically what is the 170 so transmission planners across North America. You have to use a bigger area and they have to collaborate. But also know what the scenarios are that they're using to develop their plans. You can't do things in a vacuum or a silo. And more importantly, make sure that you study severe weather impacts. You have to understand if it's a super cold day or a super hot day. You may think you're going to be in trouble on one particular day and you're thinking, well, I'll just call my neighbor for an import, but your neighbor may be experiencing the same issue. And if they haven't studied that same condition, you're both going to be in trouble. And then make sure that you coordinate resource and transmission planning. That's very difficult. Canada, as well as the US, has some disconnects between transmission and resource development and adequacy. That really needs to change. There needs to be some consistency there and more collaboration and influence on how those things get done. But then also, planners need to use some adaptive processes. What does that really mean? Well, we look at load generally, we look at resources, and we figure out how to make it work, make sure transmission can carry it. But at the end of the day, it's really more about looking at policies and things in the environment that's changing, electrification, the renewable energy, the resource mix changing, and being aware of that and understanding what you need to do as a planner to mitigate those issues. And then lastly, we heard a lot yesterday about data and modeling. But data is key. You gotta have good data and the right data. And are we collecting it today? I hope so. But we're finding there are certain things that we need to measure and maintain and evaluate to see whether or not we're getting better or worse. And then the next step of this interregional transfer capability study is to do the Canadian portion. We completed the US last month and filed it with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And now we're going to get ready to do the US to Canada portion and then the interprovincial portion. The good thing, it won't be a fire drill to get there. I'd like to share this map with you. This just gives you an idea of the wide area perspective. It's a pipe and bubble chart. The lines and the colors there represent the transfer capability that's needed between certain regions, and then the bubbles in their color represent the total capacity for that region that's considered basically a risk. Now, the areas that are gray and kind of the dark black color, that doesn't mean they're okay. It just means it didn't reveal anything using the study parameters. But don't think if you see a lot of good stuff there that it really is good. It's just for the purposes of study, it looked okay. But don't let that fool you. There's got to be some things you have to pay attention to there. And if you look, you'll notice some of the lines are dashed. Those are DC interties. It's very prominent in the west to east connection, and then you'll see some over in the Canadian connection in the northeast, and then as well as Texas being their own interconnection. Let me jump back where I should have started. This past March, NERC, in conjunction with Section 6, the Power and Energy portion of the National Academy of Engineering, held a workshop with about 50 leaders throughout the US, Canada, as well as Europe. And the key point was to look at energy adequacy for transmission and resources. It was very good, a lot of good presentations, a lot of good technical information, but we received perspectives and the obstacles that those leaders have in managing all the components of grid, not just the planning and the things we do in our daily work, but understanding the bigger picture. Out of that workshop came 9 actionable items or recommendations, and they're very key points. Some of them are sort of closely related, but basically it's very similar to the interregional transfer capability study, is that you have to have some consistency. You got to make sure planning and the resources and transmission actually talk. And then look at the duration and magnitude of load loss when you do the planning. A lot of you in the room may be familiar with the loss of load expectation, the 1 in 10 criteria. It's a good metric. It's relevant. It's still there. Still should use it. But it's really not sufficient in today's world when you have the uncertainty in resources. You have to look at other items like the expected unserved energy and also the normalized version of that looks at total load for an area. Those give you other ways of measuring and understanding what the potential for load loss is. And you want to make sure that it's not always the concern as being for peaks, winter or summer. It could be in an off-season, shoulder season, when you have no wind and a lot of resources, transmission, as well out of service. You may end up with an area that you look at that needs a margin of not 15%, but 30%. And you'll hear a little bit about that this morning as well. But then also, doing those chronological studies, that's the way you reveal it. Every hour of the day, no longer a couple hours or peak hours. You've got to do 8,760 hours of the year to find those specific points. And then get the stress components in there. Could be how the weather is impacting it, but it could also be no resources, no wind, no solar. Could be extreme heat, extreme cold, any number of things that impact that. Maintenance. You have to understand what the stresses are. And then look at a comprehensive approach load forecasting. And there was a conversation last night I was a part of talking about should distribution providers have standards. They do in the NERC world to a degree. They have to provide modeling information is one of the key things. But one thing from a planning perspective is they have to understand their load profiles. How the rooftop solar, for example, impact the grid, and it does. We've seen it in California. Solar goes away on the roof, well, the 400, 500 megawatt farm in the nearby pasture also went off the grid. So you have voltage instability and essential services that get impacted. And then also lastly is making sure planners use consistent approaches when they're using Monte Carlo simulations. And then NERC will also continue using its long-term reliability assessment to employ the LOLE, the EUE, the normalized EUE, so forth, just to name a couple. Currently, we're putting these items into play with our technical committees and industry stakeholders. And then we more recently have started collaborating with the Royal Academy of Engineering in the United Kingdom to look at what they're doing, what we're doing, and where we can gain some efficiencies and synergies in moving this needle forward. Lastly is the IBR, or the Inverter-Based Resource Initiative. I spoke on this last year as well. It's well underway. And the main reason we're doing this particular initiative is because it was revealed traditionally historical resources met 97% of the total resources under standards, the nameplate capacity. You flip the coin to the IBR side, only about 84% of the nameplate capacity had to be pertain or mandated to use the standards. The registration we're doing under our NERC rules of procedure are going to allow us to register what we're calling Category 2 to be applicable to the NERC standards. That's underway. We're identifying, and we'll begin registering later, mid-25, and then have everyone fully registered by the middle of 2026. There's a lot of good work there. And I'd also like to just put a plug in for our Information and Sharing Analysis Center. You can be members of those. It's voluntary. There is a charge for it, but it gives you a lot of information on threat intelligence. So I think that's pretty well covered. I'm over time a little bit, and I'd like to move on to our panel introductions and get those started. Our first speaker is Mike Rasavi. He is the Senior Manager of Resource Planning and Assessments at the Ontario Independent Electricity System Operator. Mike leads resource planning assessments, modeling, and economics for the Ontario electricity system. He has worked in the industry for over 15 years and has completed degrees in electrical engineering, computing technology at the University of Ottawa. Please welcome Mike Rasavi.
Thanks, Scott. Okay. Oh, there we go. I think I've gone. Yeah. Okay, all right, thanks everyone. It's great to be here. Always happy to be back in Ottawa. This is actually the very building we had our university convocation in, so it's a lot of nostalgia. I came here from the city you see in the picture here, from Hamilton. It was quite the journey getting here yesterday, but I'm glad I made it and can be here with you today. So about the IESO, I was going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because I've actually had quite a few questions this morning just clarifying what our role is in the Ontario electricity sector. So we are the system operator for Ontario. We're responsible for resource adequacy for the entire province. We operate a market. We're the contract counterparty for most of the generation in the province. In addition to being a system operator and all of the planning and operations that come along with that, we also have an innovation team that does some research and innovation on emerging technologies, distribution system operators, and ISO interfaces. We work closely with our communities through regional planning, community energy planning, ensuring that they have the resources that they need. And we also are the planner for provincial energy conservation programs, and we manage the province-wide energy efficiency programming. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about planning in two different time frames, starting with the longer-term planning. So each year we have an annual planning outlook that looks out to 2050, so it's about a 25-year forecast. The next edition should be coming out this February. We used to previously have an annual acquisition report that provided signals to investors interested in developing resources in Ontario. We've since merged the two of those reports as they're part of the same process, and it's also helpful for market participants and stakeholders to have information in the same place. The process, of course, starts with demand forecasting. We have a bottom-up end-use model that we use for looking at our demand forecast out to 2050. We then integrate that with our supply and transmission outlook. So looking at existing transmission projects, existing supply resources, as well as any committed supply and transmission resources. We then do our adequacy assessment. So with our adequacy assessment, we use the multi-area reliability simulation, so the GE Monte Carlo simulation, solving to the loss of load expectation of 1 day per 10 years per the MPCC Directory 1 criterion, which we're obligated to comply with. We look at our transmission and operability and resource adequacy needs. Then we do production cost modeling, which provides another picture in terms of what does the system look like each hour of each year as you walk through it, which has been very helpful for some of the downstream processes, whether looking at how new resources might integrate or stress testing what a really hot day in, say, 2029 might look like for the system operators. We then take all this information and insert it into an integrated needs analysis. It's more of a deterministic analysis that looks at all the different risks that we have related to resource development. So like many systems across North America, we're going to be experiencing some shortages in some resources. We're acquiring resources to meet those needs. You don't know exactly when they may come online, so there's a lot of additional risk there that's not considered in the resource adequacy modeling conducted earlier that we then integrate through the integrated needs analysis. Those result in planned actions, which is essentially a shopping list for the characteristics of resources that we need, and then they lead to procurement targets through a series of resource agnostic acquisitions. So the first challenge that we have with acquiring new resources to meet our needs is right-sizing them. So on one hand, you can overplan and have a very reliable system, but it's going to be expensive for ratepayers. We're also obligated to minimize costs to Ontarians for their electricity. So we balance cost and reliability through a cadenced series of procurements that it really captures the idea that nearer term, you have a much better idea of what's happening in your power system, and as your models go out longer and longer term, the uncertainty increases. So moving backwards chronologically, we have our longest term acquisition targets. So that's for greenfield development of new resources. So we set targets for how much we would want to acquire on, say, every few years or so through the long-term procurement mechanism. We had our first long-term procurement where we acquired about 3,000 megawatts of storage. And then looking forward at actually tomorrow, there's going to be a stakeholder engagement session on our second phase of long-term procurement, if anyone's interested in attending. Then as we get closer to the operating time frame, we have our medium term procurements. This is largely looking at extending the life of existing resources, whether that's through upgrading the resources or accepting the resources as is if there's economic life beyond their initial contract life. And then we're able to fine-tune exactly how much we need for each summer and winter annually through capacity auction, where we acquire roughly about 2,000 megawatts or so of resources each year. And we just completed the capacity auction a couple weeks ago for next year. The next challenge we have is a lot of what Scott mentioned about loss of load expectation. It's not the full picture of resource adequacy. We do set our capacity needs to meet the loss of load expectation, but part of having resource agnostic acquisitions, we also don't know what types of resources we're going to be having coming through from those. So say, for example, you set a target of 5,000 megawatts and you get 5,000 megawatts of storage. Well, you might not have enough energy production on the system to fully leverage that storage. So we've started looking at having energy and capacity targets so that we can set a capacity target, acquire some resources, remodel the system, see what it looks like, set an energy target, acquire the energy producing resources, again, remodel the system, see what it looks like so that we can continually reset those acquisition targets based on what the capacity adequacy and the energy production cost modeling is showing us. We'll shift a little bit nearer term to the operating time frame. So we're still about 18 months out. This is the time frame that we look at for our outage management planning. And this is where we see a lot, we see a lot more of the practicalities of climate change uncertainty and understanding what does the system look like when you stress test it with certain conditions. So from when the Ontario market opened until about, I think it was about 7 years ago now, we used to look at a deterministic analysis of here's our load, here's the supply that we have to meet our load. We had two scenarios, a normal weather scenario that looks at median weather, median hydrology conditions, and an extreme weather scenario that looked at extreme weather and what do the hydrology conditions look like under extreme weather. At the time, we didn't have significant solar and wind on the system, but since then, we've added more significant solar and wind resources. So we used to approve outages based on whether or not there'd be enough resources above requirement for that normal weather scenario. And then we transitioned to looking at the extreme weather scenario to capture a lot more of what can be happening on those peak days, especially during the summertime when it might be a really hot period of fairly dry weather that we tend to get in Ontario during the summer, and you may have issues with your hydroelectric resources simultaneous to increased demand from space cooling. So we shifted to looking at the extreme scenario. But if we're solving an extreme scenario to the same criteria, which is that we have enough resources above our requirement, which was zero, that we were just perfectly balanced, we wouldn't be approving any outages. So we shifted to considering that, well, on those extreme conditions, we do have some reliance on our interties. Primarily from Quebec, there's about 1,000 megawatts that we tend to be able to reliably receive during those hot weather conditions. Although they are experiencing similar conditions, it's a winter peaking utility and has been consistently able to deliver that to us on our hot summer days. The other 1,000 megawatts of that 2,000 megawatts represents the remainder of our interties. So that's with New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and Manitoba, but primarily really from New York and Michigan. So we approve outages provided that when we look at our extreme peak, we're still above that minus 2,000 megawatt supply demand balance. And just to put the 2,000 megawatts into perspective, is about a third of the total capacity on our interties. According to the NPCC intertie benefit calculation, we can rely on about 3,500 megawatts from our interties. We don't use that number for anything in our planning, and when we actually look at our long-term planning, we're only relying on about 250 megawatts or so, because that's also considering all the different times. So we'll probably see this evolve as we consider the impacts of climate change, adaptation, and considering the solar and wind and having that better correlated with the demand forecast. And then finally, as Ontario and Quebec's power systems change and evolve, and we have more formalized capacity sharing arrangements, that will also be incorporated in looking at the both long-term and outage planning timeframe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So during my presentation, I saw a few heads shake about loss of load expectation. How many planners do we have in the room? Few. Okay, great. Yeah, so you can relate to what Mike was covering, right? Yeah. Okay, excellent. All right, so our next speaker, Pierre-Olivier Pinot, earned his PhD at HEC Montreal in 2000 and is a professor at the Department of Decision Sciences, HEC Montreal, and holds the chair in Energy Sector Management since December of 2013. He is an energy policy and management specialist with a focus on electricity reforms. Pierre-Olivier has published many papers on the energy sector, most of them exploring the links between energy and some aspects of sustainable development. He participates regularly in the public debate on energy and has authored many reports for the government and other public organizations, including a book available in French named The Energy Balance. Lastly, Pierre-Olivier is a researcher and fellow at the Center for Inter-University Research and Analysis of organizations. Please welcome Pierre Oliver.
Thank you. I see Edouard coming, but it's okay. So thank you for the opportunity to present some work. I'm not a reliability person usually, but we did apply our model that you heard a little bit about yesterday, because we developed with my team the PITOS model, which is capacity expansion and operation model. For initially it was for the NPCC region that you see in blue there, based on the fact that planners are usually planning for their province or state, but we need collaboration. And as Mike mentioned, planners are planning for the least cost. They try to find the least cost solution for their state or province. But what if the least cost solution requires planning at a larger stage? And that's basically why Scott mentioned that NERC is actually looking at more collaborative issues at the NERC level. And there aren't enough studies looking at, what if we're planning at a larger scale, more than one region, but we integrate. And there are obvious regions in North America to look at. So what I'll be discussing about is the NPCC region, the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, that is basically the blue region. And looking at what our model was initially applied to that region, because there's a lot of trade and there's also lots of collaboration on mostly short-term reliability issues. But what if we look at longer term? And then what is interesting in the Northeast is that most of the states and provinces are actually looking at a 100% decarbonized sector, which is not always the case in other parts of North America. But they're not planning together. So they're all looking at what should Quebec do to get there? What should Ontario do to get there? What should New York do to get to a 100% decarbonized sector? And they all end up with their least cost solution for their own region, but sadly, it's not the least cost solution that we could have if we were collaborating. So we decided to look at, as reliability is very important, and as we hear a lot of things, on what is needed for reliability in a decarbonized sector, we said, well, let's look at that and let's do a little bit of work on that. So the criteria we're using is the planning reserve margin, which is a key metrics to measure reliability in different systems. So here I'm showing a map of that's directly taken from a NERC report, the Winter Reliability Assessment, where you see in yellow the regions, the states and provinces that would be at risk during extreme weather events. So again, what is in gray means that the NERC hasn't found that there were any specific risk in terms of reliability for this coming winter, but when you see orange, then the NERC has concluded that in case of extreme weather events, there would be some issues. And then you see New York, a little bit of, and then New England and PJM, they would be at risk not only in terms of their internal electric capacity, but also because of natural gas pipeline issues, possible natural gas pipeline issues. And that's interesting because most of the time we think in order to get reliability, we need natural gas power plants. But what if these natural gas power plants can get their natural gas? And in the Northeast US, it could be an issue. At least NERC found that it could be an issue. So maybe natural gas power plants are not always the answer to get the reliability level we want. But then again, so the question we want to ask, what if we had a 100% decarbonized sector? How do we take into account storage? Because storage is not traditionally included in this planning reserve margin, and so therefore we need to integrate it in some ways, and I'll show you how we try to integrate that. And interties also have to be integrated, and demand response have to be integrated, and to some extent they are already integrated somehow, but not, again, in a more larger regional framework. So the key questions we want to ask are, what happens to the system if we actually restrict what counts as a planning reserve margin? And basically the key equation that we want to look at is we want the available capacity to be greater than the peak load plus PRM, which is the planning reserve margin. So usually it's 10%, 20%. In some cases, it's as high as 30%, the requirements. So how much more available capacity do we want to have above the peak load? That's the key, that's the usual metrics. In our study, we're actually not looking at just peak loads because in a decarbonized sector, it's not only for the peak loads we want to have additional capacity. It could be for other times where you may have less of the variable resources you want to look at. So during these non-peak hours, do we still have reliability? Because you may, if you have fluctuating capacity, variable renewable energy capacity, then you may also have some issues meeting your load, even if it's not the peak load, because you have low resources. So that's why basically we are looking at that. So our approach is linear deterministic, but we're looking at the full 8,760 hours of the year. So it's in a way, it's like a Monte Carlo analysis where you have so many cases, but for each hour, we want to make sure there's enough capacity to meet load. We include all 5 larger regions of the NPCC regions. So we have, again, 8,760 hours. We do also have hourly wind and solar profile for every region, so we use them as deterministic, but again, we have the full real fluctuations of generation from wind and solar in all 5 regions. And then we can invest in generation, intertie, storage, demand response. But we don't have unlimited capacity to invest. There's only so much we could add. So we do have upper bounds for our investments, which I think is key to understand because, of course, if you can invest unlimited amount, then maybe the model works. But in real life, then it's not true that you can build unlimited amount of anything. And we do operate Quebec's hydro systems with storage. Of course, that's included, and it's very helpful in many instances. And we do allow for natural gas, but 100% decarbonized means that it's either renewable natural gas or natural gas with CCS with additional costs, but we do account for that. And then the key constraints we have, and then the key constraints for our study are the bottom ones, but basically, of course, we want to meet load. That's we have the hourly load balance that we have to meet. Load shedding and lost load can be used also to meet load. So basically, we do allow for some load shedding, basically coming from demand response. So we can invest in demand response. So basically, interruptible tariffs would be the way of seeing this kind of demand response, where we do offer some incentive for customers to, like a fixed payment per year, to give a percentage of their load they can take off grid, and then we pay them again in case they are called to reduce their load, then they receive also a payment. So, so that's an important tool that is already used, but probably not to the extent it should be, and it plays a big role in our analysis. So in red, you see the traditional, well, the constraint we need to meet is the qualifying capacity for what is acceptable as demand, as reserve margin should be greater than the load plus the percentage of reserve margin you want. But what is included in qualifying capacity? That is the key question. And there could be, so the installed firm capacity, which is what is usually used, but then wind and solar are used, can also be used. What we're using in our study is basically the real hourly generation from wind and solar. So whatever is produced at 1 hour can be used. So it's like if we had perfect foresight of the full year, and we're using, when it's fully working, we're using 1% of the capacity. If it's not working, then it's 0. So it's fully fluctuating across the year. Net transfer, so we don't model a firm capacity for interties. We also look at what if, again, we could know exactly how much would be coming in an optimal system. We count the net transfer between regions as being qualifying capacity. And we use battery capacity that is there, but battery capacity there are two criteria. The energy has to be in the battery and the discharge capacity has to be there. So we use the minimum of the two amounts, the amount of energy that is available or the discharge capacity of the battery. So we are sure that there is energy if we count it. And the demand response, the contracted demand response that I showed you. So basically we're running different scenarios in different ways. So it's really interesting what's happening with these slides. It's a mystery to me. So we're running scenarios with basically different, what does count as qualifying capacity evolves in our different scenarios. So in some scenarios, we say we only have the base case, we have basically just the firm capacity counts in our scenario. Then we have scenarios where transmission counts, and when storage counts, and when demand response counts. So basically, we are adding, in the scenarios we're analyzing, we're adding different levels of these qualifying capacity tools. So these are the flexibility mechanisms that we can add and include in our analysis. And then we're also putting in three different large categories of, can we add more natural gas? Can we just freeze natural gas capacity at where it is now? Or, as some people sometimes claim, should we get rid of all the natural gas? Because in a decarbonized world, maybe we shouldn't have any natural gas power plants. So we are doing all these kind of cases. And what we find is that you cannot reach some reliability reserve margin in some scenarios. So if you basically don't allow any of the transmission, storage, and demand response in your system, you cannot just even if you add the maximum amount of natural gas power plants, you cannot get the reliability margins that you are looking at just with the base case. So basically, there's not enough capacity in natural gas to offer you the reliability margins you want to have. You need to include some transmission or some demand response and storage. And of course, ideally, and that's the two lines with the full green under all scenarios, where you can get to up to 30% reliability margin, but only if you have transmission, storage, demand response in your tools to meet the reliability margin. And then you can even get 30% reliability margin if with zero natural gas, so you can still get all the natural gas out of your system and still get the reliability margins that you are looking for. Of course, that comes at a big cost, and I have a little time to finish, but so these are the yearly cost of the systems, and you see it's possible to get zero natural gas and still your reliability margin. You can get up to 10% of reliability margin if you do have, that's the upper line, transmission, storage, and demand response, up to 10% of demand response for your customers. But that's at a very, very high cost. You see around $300 billion per year. The current cost of the NPCC region to run the system, the yearly cost is around $35 billion per year. So it would be basically 10 times more expensive to run the system yearly without natural gas. So of course, if you add natural gas, the cost drops to a much lower level, and these are the kinds of levels. So this is a zoom to the lower levels. When you can add natural gas, you have costs that are around 180 billion per year, but that would mean adding only natural gas without the other tools, but beyond what is acceptable in our model. So that's why it's written, we would need 97 gigawatts of additional natural gas power plants in the region to be able to meet our reliability margins only with natural gas power plants or only with firm power plants. Hydro is included there. And as we want to lower the cost, we need to basically have natural gas, but essentially more counting transmission, storage, and demand response. And the more demand response you have, the lower the cost to achieve your reliability margin. And that's basically a big call to increase the flexibility of all users in the system to reduce their load, because unless you have that flexibility, you don't reach your reliability margins as you want. So just to conclude, flexibility resources should be viewed broadly for reliability purposes. We need to include transfer capability, storage, and demand response. The three of them are very important to have. And if you don't include them, then basically your costs are going higher. And if you don't include your neighbors, then of course the costs are also going higher. I'll stop here because I've already taken too much time. Sorry, that's a paper you can download if you want to see more results. I'll be happy to answer questions afterward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre Oliver. That's especially for the NERC pictures there and the assessments. Our next speaker, Deepak Krishnamurthy, is a technical leader in the Energy Systems and Climate Analysis Group at the Electric Power Research Institute, also known as EPRI. His research focuses on developing advanced analytical tools and methodologies for energy system analysis. He has been a key contributor to EPRI's Integrated Strategic Planning Initiative, which is also called ISSP, and Climate Ready Initiative, with research focusing on long-term capacity expansion planning, production cost modeling, and resource studies. Before joining EPRI, Deepak worked at the Environment and Climate Change Canada as Senior Economic Advisor on the Modernization of Energy 2020, and at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, also known as NREL, as a research engineer specializing in transmission and distribution system modeling. Please give Deepak a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Thanks, Scott, for the introduction. So I'm going to be presenting on practices for representing climate impacts in bulk electric system models. And most of the work that I'm presenting today is as part of this report that was published about 3 months ago. And if you search for the title of this talk in your favorite search engine, you will find this report. And it goes into more detail than I will be able to cover in 10 minutes. And this report is part of a deliverable as part of the initiative at EPRI called Climate Ready. And this is a 3-year long initiative, and most of the work that I'm presenting here is I'm representing work that is done by a number of people over a long period of time. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So in this presentation, I'm going to walk through how climate data information flows through the various models and processes involved in energy system planning. And the goal here is to consider what planners need to think about when planning electric systems in response to changing climate conditions. So at EPRI, we developed this data pipeline. So it's a process for flowing through the climate information through these various models and processes. So on the bottom of this graph, you'll see some boxes with arrows. Throughout this conference, I think we've seen some variation of this part. I think even Mike had this in his slides. So that part is typically what planners use in electric system planning. There's a development of some long-term projection of, let's say, a load forecast. Then you solve a capacity expansion problem that decides what your resources are going to be, and then you solve some sort of resource adequacy to check whether the supply can meet the demand. Then you also solve reliability or additional studies to ensure that the system has not violated any power flow limits. And this is what people typically do in transmission system planning. And what I'm going to talk about here today is the step kind of above that or before that, and that's taking into consideration climate and weather data and what kind of changes or transformations of this data that you might have to do in order to feed it into the various steps involved in this planning process. So the first step in a planning process is typically scenario design. And scenario design is defining the assumptions of how key uncertainties may evolve over a future. And typically scenarios that people typically consider are techno-economic uncertainty, supply chain uncertainty, fuel supply, policy demand. And one way to think about including climate data is just treating climate and weather data as additional scenarios on top of your existing scenarios. This does increase the problem space, and we'll talk a little bit about the consequences of that. So when you take into consideration this kind of climate data, you're considering meteorological and climatological conditions, such as temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind, and solar irradiance. And for future projections of this data, that can include weather forecasts, extrapolated historical trends, and projections based on global climate models. And at EPRI, in this report, we took into consideration Texas. So some of the slides that I'm showing here are based on Texas data. So the graph that you see on the right is the a histogram of the hourly load profile, the hourly temperature in 3 different scenarios. And you can see it kind of shifts right, or like higher temperatures in more extreme conditions, or in the future in these climate scenarios. And generally speaking, there's 2 kinds of transformations that you might want to perform across different models for climate data. There's spatial transformations and temporal transformations. And the outputs of one model are fed into another model. So you want to make sure that the transformations are consistent across different models. So for these kind of transformations, if you have highly granular data, you're upscaling the data, or if you don't have enough resolution, you're sometimes downscaling it to make sure that you have enough information. And there's some trade-offs here as well. If your capacity expansion plan does not take into consideration a nodal model, then it may not make sense to include climate data at a nodal resolution or climate data at each weather station. So it depends on the resolution of the various other models involved as well. So once we have this kind of transformation pipeline set up, then we have to start identifying what extreme weather events are. So this is the first step, and this is highly system dependent. So in Texas, for example, an extreme weather event is high temperature. But like I said, this is system dependent. A gas turbine in Texas, an extreme event for a gas turbine in Texas may be high temperature, but that same gas turbine in Ontario, the extreme event could be a very low temperature. And there are weatherization that you can perform on these different assets to make sure that they're not affected by these extreme events. So we want to identify what these extreme events are, and defining what an extreme event is it's still something that the community is kind of forming. What we've done here is we've identified some threshold based on magnitude, intensity, duration, frequency, spatial coverage, and even occurrence. So now that we've identified what an extreme event is, now we can start pulling that climate data into our models. So the first step, like I said earlier, is typically load projections. And most of the time, load projections are based on historical data or weather normalized conditions. But let's say hypothetically you had a bottom-up model, and that bottom-up model captured projections of end-use technology. Then you can model how the load might respond to weather based on what end-use technology was projected. So this can be done if you're doing this kind of bottom-up modeling. So the next step. Yeah. So the next step is after you have this load projections, you're typically you want to identify, given some extreme event, how does that affect the various assets on an electrical grid? So there's transmission system assets, transmission lines, or generation assets, different generators, and there's various vulnerabilities that different types of generators might encounter. So, for example, a solar panel in heavy snow condition might just have a cover of snow, so that can take its generation down from 100% of what it could generate down to zero. In Texas, for example, the higher temperature can end up derating. You may not be able to run your plants at their max capacity. So I think Pierre had a equation where he showed the installed capacity or the capacity available. So imagine you had that equation, but now the capacity available in your capacity expansion plan is not as much as you could have because of some extreme event, because your generators have been derated. So you may not be able to meet your reserve margin because of that. So I mentioned with this kind of additional scenario, you may blow past your computational budget for solving this type of problem. So that's where we've introduced risk screening, and this is basically identifying key periods where the system is more likely vulnerable to not being able to meet the load given some supply based on weather conditions. So this is somewhat like a resource adequacy model, but uses weather data to determine how these generators, if they are derated, whether they're still able to meet the supply. And this is just identifying the period. So you can see at the graph at the bottom, on the left, there's all the weather scenarios, but then on the right, there's some key time periods that have been highlighted based on the outputs of this risk screening model. And these key time periods you can then use in your capacity expansion model or resource adequacy model to make sure that your system is meets the supply and has the supply to meet the demand in those time periods. Okay, so once you have this screening model that identifies these periods with high risk, then these can be passed into the investment planning model, the resource adequacy model, the production cost model, and so you can see again at the bottom of this graph, there's those key periods, and for the capacity expansion plan, you might only take into consideration a subset of that. But for the resource adequacy, you want to take into consideration as many scenarios as possible to make sure that you have covered like a diverse range. You might run your production cost model in like a higher fidelity, and that could give you some better results about how the climate data affects the system. And I guess in summary, I want to say that having climate data that's consistent across these different models is important, and identifying what the extreme events are for the particular system is crucial because they all are highly system dependent. And understanding how each asset can be affected by a climate data or by these extreme events is also key. And finally, identifying those key risk time periods is what can make this problem computationally tractable. Again, there's a lot more information that I could have covered as part of this presentation. I will I'll defer to the report for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. Definitely shows some areas of risk that are not where you expect them sometimes. Our final speaker today is going to be with us remotely, so they'll have her up here on the screen shortly. Dr. Michelle Yazdani is a group leader of macro energy systems at the Urban Energy Systems Laboratory, EMPA, Switzerland. Utilizing her background in engineering from the University of Waterloo in systems design engineering, along with a master's and PhD from ETH Zurich in Switzerland, she specializes in sustainable energy systems modeling and analysis. Her past work includes applications in solar, ocean, wind, and biogas energy, electric mobility, carbon capture, decentralized generation, and urban energy systems planning. Dr. Yazdani has collaborated with international organizations and research institutes on climate resilience and sustainability. Her recent transdisciplinary partnership with researchers in West Africa focused on advancing energy systems planning models to enhance urban energy system resilience. She is a dedicated advocate to international collaboration to co-create resilient, equitable, and sustainable societies. Please welcome Dr. Yazdani.
Hi, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen, which I hope you can see now. In case you can't hear me, just stop me. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going, assuming everything's fine. So thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here today. It's my privilege and honor to be part of this distinguished group of panelists. I would start by, well, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Actually, I would have loved to. I'm based in Switzerland, where EMPA is at the Urban Energy Systems Lab, so that's where I'm speaking to you from. And today I want to present a little bit of work that we've done on a research project, which was in collaboration with some research partners in West Africa, but is still, the methodologies are transferable and meant for cities worldwide for planning for better sustainability and for resilience. And so with the theme of the collaborative approaches to system reliability, this is very much in line with that, but even goes a little bit further, I would say, in terms of planning for longer term resilience and longer term sustainability. So it has a bit of a longer term outlook using modeling tools compared to maybe some of the other talks that we had today. So it's very complementary, and I see quite a few links. So yeah, these are the other researchers who are involved in the project, and I'll be presenting two kind of key works here. So without further ado, I'll jump into the topic and a little bit of an introduction. So we are talking about uncertainty, I think, in a lot of these cases. And when we're talking about resilience, it's the ability of a system to withstand a disruption, adapt to a disruption, and recover from that. And so when we're talking about uncertainty, there's a lot of different aspects. So we have resource shortages that could occur in the long term, not just with fossil fuels, but also with hydropower under climate change. We have natural disasters and outages to deal with under climate change. We have rising energy demand because of migration patterns from rural to urban areas, also due to increased temperatures. You have rising cooling demand, which can be disruptive to a grid. And we have aspects also of financial uncertainty in a lot of countries, and that affects all planning. So all of these are kind of elements that we have to deal with our long-term planning. So the objectives of this project, called the Measures Project, which is about transforming our modeling approaches for more resilient and sustainable planning, is to develop these methods. We looked at it in the context of the Global South, given that the climate vulnerability of communities, especially coastal communities, like the case study that I'll show you today. But in this project, as I mentioned, it's meant to be transferable methods. We're creating general frameworks, and we wanted to transfer the knowledge and the methods, models, and data that we developed to energy planners worldwide so that they can also potentially benefit from this work. And so what we focused on in this project is representing factors that are not typically well covered in this scope of energy system optimization models for long-term capacity planning. looking at socio-technical factors, techno-economic factors, climate change impacts, and overall how to improve resilience. So specifically, we looked at things like extreme heat. We looked at flooding from the climate change perspective. We looked at changes in hydropower. From the economic perspective, we looked at something called the informal economic sector, how a economy informally, which are figures that are not officially accounted for in your GDP, how are they considered, or they affect your energy planning, currency depreciation as well, how it affects your planning, suppressed energy demand, power system failures, all sorts of things. And so we worked with a very transdisciplinary group of researchers across economics, climate science, power systems, and we were the energy modelers in this case to develop these methods. And we collaborated with a whole number of different organizations and research institutes in this project. So our workhorse for this was building a model for our case study area, which was in Accra and Ghana, which I didn't mention very clearly, I think. So we were working on this case study, and here we used Osmosis, which is an open source, open access modeling framework that some of you may have heard of before. So the spirit of this project was to be open in nature. So we used this open access model, which built a model from 2020 to 2050. And you don't need to read all the details of this, but this basically represents our energy system. So we have on the left side our fuels that would be or energy carriers that are imported into the model, and on the right side you would find your different demands for electricity, cooling, cooking, lighting, and transportation. And then in between you have all different kinds of ways to convert those energy carriers to meet your demands. And so one of the outputs then, or two of the key outputs from these models are how do you plan your capacity, what do you install when, and how do you operate that as well. And so we looked at this time horizon until 2050. Now, particularly for this, the uncertainty scenarios we looked at for the case of Accra, we looked at volatile fossil fuel supply based on historic trends. We looked at volatile hydro generation. That's something more applicable in the case of Canada and Ontario. We looked at unplanned outages as well. We looked at currency depreciation impacts over time and how they can affect long-term planning, and rising demand because of things like cooling, increasing demand, or rural-urban migration under different climate change scenarios from the IPCC. And so I'm going to quickly show you two key papers, which they're openly available as well. So you can see this one here. This is on using optimization models for planning for resilience. And as we saw also in some of the previous talks, typically we have optimization targets, which are that I want to design a system that minimizes costs or emissions, or a combination of both of these things. And what we did in this paper, we proposed a method to maximize the resilience instead as an objective, using a weighted index. And that weighted index considered different factors of resilience. So looking at the balance of generation across different technologies, your security of supply based on your resources, the level of decentralization you have, the variety of technologies you have, the redundancy you have in a system, and the efficiency and the CO2 emission reduction as well, which is more of a long-term sustainability and resilience target. And so what we did at first is we compared our system to, we looked at Accra here, and we said we just want to look at how you would design a system with cost minimization. And so this is the levels of generation you would get from different technologies, with red being from waste combined cycle plants, and the different shades of oranges and yellows being from solar photovoltaics. And in purple you have cooling with air conditioners. And what we compared this to is how would you design a system when you maximize resilience? And then what you see here is a much more colorful spread of the technologies and generation balanced across them. And so the question we wanted to investigate then is, how does this system that we designed with resilience in mind compare when you look at stress cases? And so here what I show you in one snapshot is what the cost savings are of our resilience optimized system compared to the cost optimized system, looking at uncertainty scenario in a given year of 2050 and what it would cost. On the left, the far left side, you see the total system cost is about 40% more expensive to design the resilient system, but that's over the entire lifetime from 2020 to 2050. And the other 5 bars that you see here are the in 1 year what the costs would be when you have different shock scenarios like the volatile fossil fuel demand increase, outages, and when you have multiple shocks, cascading effects happening. And what we see is that in 1 year, we have a cost savings of about $4 billion US, which covers the more than the entire cost of the investment of the system. So one of the key messages here is it's worthwhile designing a system for resilience, even if that doesn't appear cost optimal when you just look at a cost optimal objective. In reality, it can save you a lot of money. This is just a snapshot of 1 year, so you can imagine over several years of a lot of uncertainties what the cost savings might be. So that's one paper, and I'm going to quickly show you a second one, which is on strengthening energy system resilience planning by using a concept called regret, which is here we have another open access paper you can also have a look at here. And so regret, I don't know, have much time to go into the mathematical definition, but I think the feeling we can all relate to. So here's the feeling of regret that we all understand. And so there's in decision making under uncertainty, there's a way for us to express that mathematically. And so what that is we identify something called a loss function, which is essentially our cost of a system. So we can say it's a cost of a system subject to a given uncertainty scenario, like volatile fossil fuel prices. And it's the difference between that cost and the best possible cost that I could have achieved if I had designed another system, knowing that that was going to be my uncertain future. So knowing that I'm going to run out of fossil fuels in I don't know, 5 years from now, what would I design as a system then? And so that difference is what we call regret. So if you did make the best decision, you would have zero regret. And if you didn't, you would have some amount of regret defined mathematically this way. In a simple example, if we have 3 systems, call them A, B, and C here, and 2 uncertainty scenarios, we would see that we can calculate our loss for each of these. So this is our total cost for each system subject to each uncertainty scenario. We can calculate the regret by taking that lowest possible value and the difference between the other costs. And then there's now we have to decide what kind of system we're going to make, right? So here there's 2 ways, and one is if we design a system that's robust, optimally robust. In that case, what we do is we look at what the maximum regret is across all of these different systems, and we want to minimize that value. So in this case, system B gives us the minimum maximum regret, and that's our robust system. And otherwise, we can also have a stochastic solution, which would assign probabilities to these different scenarios. And so U1 and U2 would have some values, and we end up with a different system here. It's just a simple average. And so you see that you would go for system A if you're looking at probabilities of these uncertainties. So we applied this then to 3 different systems that we could have designed from the energy system perspective. One was cost minimal, one was CO2 minimization, and one was balancing both. And then again, we had on the horizontal, the vertical bars here, the columns, we have different uncertainty scenarios. We calculated the regret, and then we found what the optimal robust decision would be, which is a CO2 minimized system and a stochastically optimal decision. So this is I'm doing this very quickly, just a 3-minute 3-minute overview, but we had many other variations of this. But I just wanted to give you kind of the take-home messages from this. Overall, it's very imperative for us to improve our energy system modeling methods to have better foresight and encompass also socioeconomic and climate change uncertainties that will arise in the future. And if we assume perfect conditions, as we often do in our models, we'll end up planning systems that are suboptimal and result in higher costs in the end. Some of the methods that we demonstrated in this project show that we can plan better for resilience under a variety of different shock scenarios, which would be defined for the given geographic context. We can, through this process, helps us to identify what the system vulnerabilities are and what our adaptive capacities are of a system. We see that there are significant impacts of considering shocks on resilient urban energy system planning, and that if we consider them in advance, there are dramatic cost savings that can be gained also by planning for resilience. In the particular case of Accra, we saw that waste, combined cycle plants, solar photovoltaics, and electrification of the transportation are very critical in its transition for sustainability and resilience coupled together. But the methods, again, are open access, open source, and they are meant to have low barriers for implementation for energy planners worldwide. So I hope that they'll also would be useful in also the global north as well as the global south. Overall, also in this project, I think one of the key messages is that we need to work better in a inter and transdisciplinary approaches to adopt those to tackle these problems with greater foresight, so that we can actually plan for genuinely more resilient systems in the end. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I put some paper references here. You can also, the project QR code, there's a project website on the bottom right here. And if you want to know a bit more about our lab and my research, there's the top one there. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Yazani. This brings us to our questions and answer session. And I'm now worried about I have to deal with regret also. It's a new item for me. So yeah, kick off the first question here. This relates to, more specifically to Mike with IESO. How does IESO plan for new nuclear in a world of technology agnostic procurements? If nuclear would be beneficial in the long term, do you expect it to be procured as a part of the IESO's technology agnostic procurements?
Thanks. Sorry, is this on? Yep. Okay, so our nuclear planning is a little bit different. So they're very large, very costly, very long lead time resources. So it tends to be, I think a lot of what I talked about was how we acquire resources from independent power producers. On the nuclear side, tend to be driven more by provincial policy. So as we look at our demand forecasts and our supply demand balance going forward, there's always going to be some level of base load need, and the desire to become a carbon-free electricity system by 2050. We're constantly looking at how can we decarbonize that base load electricity. Given the supply chains, the knowledge, and the existing nuclear operators in Ontario, we use that analysis to advise government on whether or not we should undertake future nuclear resource acquisitions. Another peculiarity of Ontario is, well, a lot of our generation is contracted. We actually have a mix for nuclear. So the Bruce Power Plant has a contract with the IESO, whereas the Ontario Power Generation facilities at Darlington and Pickering are rate-regulated assets where the OEB regulates their rates. About last summer, there was a report from the provincial government called Powering Ontario's Growth, and within that called on building 3 additional, in addition to 1 SMR at the Darlington site. So we have 4 SMRs at Darlington in our forecast, looking at the refurbishment of Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, or half of it anyway, and then looking at development of potential new nuclear sites, starting with new 4 reactor, potentially up to 4,800 megawatts at the Bruce C. So for that large nuclear component, it's on as sort of a parallel track to the acquisition mechanisms that I had discussed.
Thank you. Would any of our other presenters add that? This next one was, oops, I lost my place. Here we go. So, I guess kind of directed at Pierre Oliver, but I think it applies to everyone here. In Pierre's presentation, he used historical wind and solar data in an hourly planning reserve margin constraint. But how would you account for future uncertainty? Wouldn't it be safer to account for only a portion of the wind generation to ensure its firmness?
So in our research, we actually use different years. I mean, I showed you the results for 1 year, but we've conducted some robustness analysis using different loads from different years, different wind profile and solar profile from different years. Of course, the results are slightly different each type, but the overall trend in our results are that really you need to combine transmission, storage, demand response in order to get the lower cost. We did some analysis with nuclear, and of course, if you add nuclear, then that helps a lot in terms of reliability. So costs are again going down, but that doesn't really, remove the need to have transmission, storage, and demand response. So we haven't used future wind and solar profiles, but from all the research I've seen, future wind profiles and future solar profiles are actually not different from the current ones. So there is no climate change. Well, there's no documented climate change impact on wind profiles in the future, as far as I've seen.
Anyone else like to respond to planning reserve margins? Yeah. I'd like just to add a little touch point to Edward. Are these presentations going to be made available Excellent. At the end of my presentation, there's a lot of links to various resources, and we're talking about PRM, reserve margin level, preference level, LOLE, EUE. A lot of those are defined in the evolving report that was done by the workshop. Helpful to understand what those mean and get those in context. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Hi.
First.
Yeah, Greg Robart with the Smart Grid Innovation Network. This is a question for all of you. I heard modeling on real power. I heard modeling on energy. I heard some neat modeling on some new socioeconomical dimensions, I'll say. But I didn't hear any of you talk about inertia. And if you don't model inertia, your results are going to be overly optimistic. And I'm just curious if you could comment on how you dealt with inertia in your models.
I can start. Right now in Ontario, we're lucky that we have a lot of large spinning masses between our hydro nuclear fleets and our gas generation. So I think right now we take it for granted that we have a significant amount of inertia in the system. So as we develop an increased penetration of IBR resources, it will become increasingly important for us to look at inertia. It does become a little bit more interesting when you're looking at pockets of the province and smaller areas to understand the inertia in those areas. So for example, if we're looking at part of the province that may have a fairly thin power system with some hydro in that region, we would, and comparing different options for meeting those needs, there would likely be a preference toward maintaining the hydro in the region so that you'd have that inertia on that relatively thin power system.
And just to touch on that as well, one aspect of so modeling inertia requires modeling a bunch of differential equations and dynamics, and that's much more computationally intensive. And typically, we just ignore that entirely in the capacity expansion problem. We even ignore it in the production cost modeling and the resource adequacy. But what we can do is, given the results of a capacity expansion model, we can feed those into a differential equation solver and identify whether those, a select number of periods. So you subset the total number of periods into the key areas of interest, and then identify whether those periods are stable. And if they're not, you feed some information back into the capacity expansion model. Sometimes it's just a planning reserve margin. Sometimes you say this additional constraint has to be imposed to ensure that inertia requirements are met. And that kind of feedback, I think, is pretty important. But again, sometimes it can take weeks to run some of these models, and sometimes you just have only so much time. So I guess planners should start thinking about how long it would take to pull all of these pieces together. Having a consistent data format across these different models can help a lot. Right? We saw some of that work talked about yesterday, and I think that's pretty important.
Deepak, Dr. Yazani, do you have anything to follow with? Oh, cannot hear you.
Sorry, now you can hear me. Classic mute problem. So no, I think that covers it quite well. Also, we have, because we're looking at these long-term capacity expansion models, we don't consider it at such a high level, and because we have linear models as well, we're not able to consider inertia in that level of detail. I think it depends on the objective that you have. So because we had this long-term planning mindset, we were not looking at that level of details, but we have a separate set. Actually, within this project, we're looking at how EVs, electric vehicles, will affect the grid stability. And so there's a different set of models altogether that they're looking into that level of detail. So again, depending on the question that you have, you look at it from different with different modeling tools. Another way there's the inertia of just trying to change an entire system for planning for long-term, resilience, which is which in our models we consider through, for example, what minimum for changing the distribution grid, what are the rates at which we can adapt them? What are the rates, the maximum penetration rates for EV? How much can the grid handle for solar PV penetration? And so we implement that in our model through constraints of limiting how much PV you can install when, how much EV penetration can you have, to account for the time that it would take to allow the system to be designed in the longer term for something that's more resilient or sustainable. So I hope that touches at least on some different dimensions of considering inertia.
Yes, thank you. We have another question from the room.
Thank you. Yeah. Question for Dr. Yazdani. What exactly is waste CC combined cycle? Because we usually think of waste as very low energy content. So is this some biogas thing or something like that? And then you've now prompted a second question, which is, are you contemplating in the model using the EV fleet as a storage asset in the system as well?
Yeah, so the EV, we treated that very simply. So we did not consider using it for storage at all, like in a virtual power plant kind of format. So we left that out. And waste combined cycle was, I believe it was waste incineration and then a combined cycle with a steam steam generator, and then recovering heat as well from there, I believe. So it was, so that for waste was mainly from, there's a significant waste resource that's being completely underutilized in Accra. So using biomass waste mainly, also seeing if we can incorporate sewage sludge there. So there's different ways that they're now considering how they can collect the waste and then utilize it for waste incineration and then electrification.
They're contemplating direct combustion as opposed to biogas production or something.
Yeah. In this, so we gave a couple of different options, and this was the because of the electricity needs, was selected as an optimal solution.
Interesting. We have another question from the room.
Philip Doust, little question in terms of NERC regulations for those of us who absolutely love NERC audits. Are we seeing in the future, should we expect to see further regulations on the distribution network? With the event, the growth of inverter-based resources coming up, we're talking a lot about inertia. Is that something that one would expect in terms of the long-term planning of the distribution network and those types of regulations seeing their way down that way?
Yeah, interesting question. This actually came up last night a little bit. The NERC does have jurisdiction over the distribution providers, and primarily today that's in place for under-frequency load shedding and under-voltage load shedding, where the distribution provider provides those as a safety net and asset to the bulk power system. The other side of it is they have to provide modeling data. And we're working now with different standards to improve the area of modeling information that goes to the planners with respect to not just the load information, but also the resources that are behind the distribution station. Namely, to make sure that the distribution providers understand what they're interconnecting in their system and what capacities there, where it's located, just to be able to inform the power flow models. But since they are an entity that has to be registered with us, there's always the opportunity there, if we need to do some reliability work. And typically NERC chooses the path of a reliability guideline to start with to see how that changes and evolves the risk that's been discovered. And if it doesn't work, we go to the reliability standard format. So our next question is probably geared more around the EPRI work. Are there any particular knowledge gaps regarding the impacts of climate change, extreme events on renewable energy assets, or do you consider this to be well understood?
I don't think this is well understood at all. I think this is a fairly new area, and there's not a lot of standard research that's done in this space. I think in addition, there's, at least as a power system planner or modeler, understanding how weather or climate affects different assets and in all the different ways it can affect different assets is actually pretty complicated. I found it's pretty complicated, and there's lots of nuance there. And there's not standard ways to model it, or once if you start taking into consideration all the different curves that can represent how the performance of an asset changes based on whether your model suddenly becomes nonlinear, and you start have to make simplifications, and what simplifications you make is not at all something even two people that are experts will agree on, I think. So that's certainly a challenge, and I think more input there would be great.
Okay, thank you. Is there any additional information?
Yeah, it's something we look into a lot as well. I think some areas we're looking at is better correlating the wind and solar data with demand, so that you have the same weather conditions impacting the solar and the wind as the demand. I think at peak times we have a better idea of how climate change is going to impact our wind and solar resources, but looking at throughout the years, that's when there's a lot of complexity. And when you're looking at a geographic range the size of Ontario, you then have geography as another dimension. So different parts of the province are being impacted by climate change differently, and this is very impactful when you're also looking at hydrology. And there's certain water systems that are going to be drier and certain water systems that are going to be wetter, but overall I think they're all going to be a lot more variable. So I think we're just scratching the surface on understanding a lot of these climate change impacts.
Dr. Yazami, you have any follow-up?
Oh, no, that's good.
No? Okay. All right, the next question here is, for modeling practices used to determine decisions and outcomes for different grids, how important is it to include Monte Carlo analysis after a capacity expansion analysis? Without looking at risk, how credible is it for grid reliability? So for anyone that wants to take a stab.
I think it's important, depending on, again, on your goal of your model and your analysis. In our case, our first goal was to try to expand the policy planning horizons, and that's because we think that we're too province-centered or too state-centered in North America, and we need to include more the other ones in collaboration and in planning. So I would say it's not so key to have right away the Monte Carlo analysis, but of course the Monte Carlo analysis will be very interesting if people are interested and see, wow, we can get these kind of better results if we collaborate more across provinces and states. Then to get even more credible solutions and results, then we need to go through the Monte Carlo analysis. But there are different steps. But initially, at a higher level, I think it's important to illustrate the fact that we should plan for more transmission and what are the benefits of more transmissions. And overall, these values, although high level, I think they're really robust. But then, of course, we need to go deeper and then analyze deeper what are the exact inertia implications and all the types of implications we need to look at.
I think it's incredibly important. So as our capacity expansion model is largely deterministic, and there's a lot of attributes that aren't considered in there. So some of the more stochastic elements are considering the declining effective load carrying capability of resources as you increase their penetration. So something we started doing is after we do this deterministic analysis, for example, using capacity expansion, is then putting it into Monte Carlo models such as the multi-area reliability simulation to then see are we meeting our resource adequacy criteria when you do look at the stochastic elements.
Thank you.
I think, if I
I guess I'll just add one more point that if you did try to take into consideration this uncertainty in your capacity expansion model, your model will be much more computationally intractable. And doing Monte Carlo analysis is like easily parallelizable and can get you some of that same information, especially if you have feedback involved. So yeah, it's just different ways to do the same thing, I guess.
And I
Dr.
think
Zadani,
one
do
of
you have something?
Yeah, if I may add, I think one of the key messages also of this entire project that we find, or one of our motivating reasons to do it, is because of the lack of uncertainty analysis that we do tend to include in generally energy system optimization models. It's easy not to deal with uncertainty, and largely we don't, as an overall field. We tend not to, and I think it's very important for us to do it. There's a lot of reasons that we don't want to. One, we don't know what the uncertainties are. It becomes a political question. It becomes it becomes a point of contention often dealing with these uncertainties. How do you plan around them? What probabilities do you assign them? But we have a lot of tools under our belt, not just Monte Carlo analysis, but a lot of other methods in uncertainty analysis, one of which was regret, which we employed in our analysis. And they require also different levels. Like Monte Carlo can become computationally intractable if you're going to run, big models with a lot of uncertainties. But there's ways to make it more tractable. And so one of the things we tried to do in this study is also give some more tractable approaches to give you a starting point for how to go about uncertainty analysis. Because if we don't include it until later on, we often design the system and then we decide to see how it performs afterwards. And what we argue is that much earlier in the planning stage, we need to include explicitly uncertainty analysis in the process so that we end up with systems that are not only more reliable, but more resilient and more sustainable in the long run.
Thank you. All right, so we're reaching down to the 2-minute mark, and we have a question from the audience.
Thank you. This question is probably for Dr. Yazdani, but I'd welcome anyone's reflections. My name is Taylor Binnington. I'm working at the Stockholm Environment Institute. I noted your papers with great interest. I will read them after this. And I'm curious, because the notion of sort of low or least regrets decision making is very closely tied to sort of integrated resource and resilience planning. And it's we've done a little bit of this work in Southeast Asia at SEI as well. I'm wondering, did you consider any sort of non-cost related notions of regret that evaluate sort of how well your scenarios perform under those circumstances, possibly even outside of the energy sector? Because this conversation has focused on sort of externalities to energy and their impacts on the energy sector, but not so much the other way around. And I'm wondering if you looked at that or
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a great question, and it's what we're trying to. So we have these in the end we have this computational model, right? So what we did is and I didn't go into these details, but how we assigned our loss function was kind of through a damage function. So we represented costs in terms of damages, basically when you have energy that can't be met, and you try to represent it in terms of economic loss. If the industrial sector is not operating, you even had different by sectors. You have different damage costs, basically of this. So unfortunately, we had to translate it in the end to a quantitative value because of the modeling framework that we were dealing with. But what informed that entire process, we tried to include these socioeconomic issues as well. So, for example, talking about the informal sector and climate migration. So these are all very social, impacts that you have on a society. But what we had to develop together with our transdisciplinary group was that when we had the climate migration scenario in a IPCC, what they call the shared socioeconomic pathway, SSPs. That's what we used as our kind of guidance. And they have different climate migration scenarios. And so what we linked was, how does the climate migration to the city affect the informal sector? And the informal sector, basically 80% of the population in Accra are employed informally, meaning that their economic outputs, although they drive the economy, they're not officially accounted for in the GDP. And so they tend to be a low energy intensity sector. But when you have climate migration, we look at how that exacerbated informality, and we link that to energy consumption. So we tried to link these social issues, socioeconomic issues, as much as we could to something quantitative, so that we could run this type of framework of a model. But again, there are probably other methodologies and other models in social sciences that could be employed to help us do this better. But in the end, that's what we translated it to, was basically how do we translate essentially human suffering into a value? And that's a very difficult thing to do when you have outages, and it affects how do we quantify the loss in the residential sector compared to the service sector compared to the industrial sector. And so we were able to get some references with some numbers and things, but at the end of the day, when we were looking at flooding impacts, there's also like a loss of life life value. Essentially, this is what insurance companies also do when they're trying to calculate, how best to operate. So yeah, long story short, we translated it into numbers, but how well I would stand by those, I don't even know. I mean, it's a huge uncertainty in itself, is those values actually that we even use in these models. But it's a first attempt to at least think about the problem, because I think as engineers, at least in my world, growing up, we don't really think about these things. We treat the transition problem as if it's just a technical problem, and we just have to replace fossil fuels with renewables, and the impacts that it has on society, and the impacts it has in context in the global south as well. We don't tend to think about, and we need to do that better in our modeling approaches. So this was a one research attempt at doing that.
Well, thank you. We're just a tad over, and just want to make sure, is there any follow-up to the question? Okay. Well, great. Well, I encourage, there are a number of other questions. If you didn't get your question answered and you're here in the room, feel free to see any of the panelists here. I'd like to thank each of you for attending as person and remote, and we look forward to this again, the continued collaboration. Edward, thank you.